Burdett is the director of the Urban Age, as I'm sure you all know, but also chief advisor on architecture and urbanism to the Olympic Delivery Authority in London.
Thank you very much, and wonderful to see so many of you here and to see familiar faces from all over the world. I gather that we've had people arriving in the last 24 hours from Quito, from Sao Paulo, from Tokyo, and from your neighbors here, London, by comparison. So it's wonderful to have such a real international event. And again, I thank Wolfgang Novak and Joseph Ackermann for allowing us to do this. I want to do two things in my allocated time. One is to talk just very briefly about how does this conference work. Some of you have been at them before, some of you haven't, and then speak about the themes which have cut across the conferences to date, but most importantly the themes that I think are relevant to this discussion about Indian cities, coming out of the intense research done by the LSE team, but together with Tata Institute of Social Sciences and others, which is very much summarized in this document, which is the newspaper which was given out to all of you. Some of it is in fact on the walls over there, just some summaries, but importantly, in January we will be submitting a big fat report, which we hope to present to the Prime Minister's office, and I know that one of his key advisors is here. Now, one of the first things I must say is that please, if you have a pink version of this, tear it up and use the green one. But I see that most of you do have a green one. There are just a few changes to it, and I think it's important that you stick to this document to make sure that you see how the program actually works throughout the day. Basically, it's a two-day conference. We hope that to see as many of you here throughout the 2 days, not just for your session and then leave. And there are 6 sessions which I'll go through in a second. We expect about 50 people to speak, that is, as main speakers, as some of the Urban Age experts, and also people we have asked to respond. And this is where Howard, who's very good at this, I have to warn you, show your pieces of paper there maybe, Howard. He's got cards which tell you you've got 5 minutes, 3 minutes, or go away because you're going on for too long. Now, this is very important because to be respectful really to all of you, it's important to keep within the time frame so that we get as much out of the mix of people and the interdisciplinary range of people who are here. So while we will have speakers who are allocated between 20 and 10 minutes, depending on the subject, the respondents are asked to talk for about 2, 3, 4 minutes. Please stick to it. It's very, very important. We will ask some of the respondents to talk from the floor. They've already been primed, and others we will be circulating cards, and if you have burning issues that you would like us to raise, and if we have the time, Chairman, we will have those cards at the front and perhaps ask some of those questions. So that's more or less how it's done. The structure of the event, we're running a little bit late as we've said, is to have these 6 themes which really deal with the big issues that cut across all cities, but particularly the Indian cities that we have been researching. We're going to start with this session to talk about the global context and the impacts of globalization on Indian cities. We then move to the critical thing is, given all this, how do you create a future of a city? What role does making a vision and getting the politicians to follow that? We will then look at the key issue of urban inequality. Joseph Ackermann has already used the statistics, which are very evocative, but how do you house the urban poor? And we're going to be doing something which is perhaps controversial, perhaps difficult, to go from the macro to the micro, to look at the proposals currently on the table for Dharavi, one of the biggest slums in the world, but also one of the richest textures in terms of the life of the city and the economy of this city, and that's where we will be concluding today. Tomorrow, Nick Stern and Sheila Dixit will be talking about climate change, both globally and in terms of the innovative experiences of Delhi. We will move to the critical aspect of then how do you do it when you set all these agendas? How do you actually plan cities? And we will be concluding, which is very much one of the key themes of this conference as a whole, as the series of conferences, by bringing in city leaders from José Serra, the Governor of Sao Paulo, who in fact will host the next event, Enrique Peñalosa, representatives from London, from other cities around the world, to talk together with their Indian colleagues from 4 or 5 of the cities that we've been working in to really have a summary of where we can go next and what lessons have been learned. But let me try and describe very briefly what lies behind the issues. What have we learned? What would we like to share with you as a result of the research we've done, which might leave a legacy? And this is very much one of the ideas of Wolfgang Nowak in particular, that we leave something behind. We don't just come and go. I think that's very important. And the institution of the Deutsche Bank Urban Age Award, which was awarded yesterday, I think is the beginning of that relationship. We've heard about these statistics. I'm not going to go there again. It's clear. But this is what happens when you look at the world in half close your eyes. This is where human habitation has left its footprint. And you can see that's actually in the areas, obviously, of the Indian subcontinent that human habitation is at its most dense and focused. But probably the most important thing, and this lies at the heart of the agenda, the intellectual agenda of the urban age, is understanding what all these numbers mean in terms of the reality of people on the ground. Now, I'm an architect, so before I say what I'm about to say, architects don't get offended, please. But this is a typical view of a typical global city. It happens to be Caracas, and it's a picture I took from a helicopter. And on my left, tower blocks, buildings. Basically, you see what architects do. Not very good buildings, some of them actually, frankly, ugly. That's not the point. The key point is that the space between the buildings doesn't constitute city, or what Sasson calls cityness. There's no sense of the relationship between the buildings and the public space, the glue that makes society in a way possible. Next to that, you see what transport planners do. Again, don't be offended. Transport planners design cities as pieces of transport to get people from A to B, sometimes not thinking about what severance that has on existing communities. So you have architecture, transport planning, and then that mass of 250,000 people is what people do. And that is something which is highly relevant and poignant, of course, to the Indian context. And I think if the urban age is about something, it's about trying to create a cross-section across this photograph in understanding and relinking, perhaps, disciplines that for too long have never spoken. Because you might think that this is a Photoshop image. In other words, this has just been constructed by me to make an effect. It's not. It's an aerial view of Heliópolis in São Paulo. And I'm sorry to say this, Governor Serra, I'm using your city as an example of perhaps what not to do. But on the left, you have a place which has its own life, it has its own identity, but it has very little water and very few sewers and lacks basic infrastructure. On the other side, you have a new tower block built by some architects for people who are so rich that they have water on swimming pools on their terraces. That is the issue that I think we're trying to deal with here and share with you. How do you avoid that? How do you avoid making cities that are forever exclusive in terms of their agencies and constituencies? And ultimately, and this is the great political point and why it was so encouraging to hear Angela Merkel yesterday speak about this, and we have so many key politicians here, it is a political decision whether you let a city like Mexico City just grow and grow and grow. This is another picture taken from an airplane. I know that next time one of us would fly over the city, the boundary wouldn't be there. It would be far further up. It would be chewing up this valuable piece of green, which is so important to the sustainability argument that we'll hear about tomorrow. So we have choices. You can either go this way, which is Mexico City today, or you can do, and I'm not being particularly pro-American here, but why not for a moment, what the fathers of New York City did, that they decided about 150 years ago to, yes, create a dense city, but to create a wonderful urban lung at the middle of it. This is Central Park in a strange view, but you see the relationship between the density of the buildings, one of the highest real estate values in the world, ultimately a livable city because of the relationship of the two. So again, I stress that for us in the urban age, everything we've been looking at is trying to understand the connections. Now we have choices, I repeat that again. We can either do what visionary architects do. Visionary architects were the ones behind the Pudong financial district in Shanghai. Unfortunately, in this case, they followed it. There it is. Now, again, it's not an issue of aesthetics. It's an issue of what is it like on the ground. we know the experience of walking around these spaces. We know, as Richard Sennett will talk about later, that this is a brittle environment which cannot change with society as the economy changes and society itself changes. These are fixed elements which don't connect to the ground in many ways and don't connect to the fabric of society. Something that, of course, in many of the Indian cities we're beginning to see emerge, especially on the fringes of the fast-growing cities. We have a choice, as in Shanghai, either to do more of this, which is to get people round, and to do as they've done now, to stop bicycles, where they have, in fact, 9 million bicycles in Shanghai, to stop bicycles from central streets. Why? Because they cause congestion. So these are interesting issues that I think politicians and others need to address. And this is why Philip Brodé and other colleagues at the LSE and TIS have spent so much time doing research, which I cannot, of course, summarize in a short presentation here, but permeates many of the presentation by LSE colleagues over the last 2 days, and again, I say are reflected in the documentation that you have. But they are the issues that lie behind the construction of the new Mumbai. What is it going to look like? What is it going to feel like when all these new buildings, all the cranes that you see are there? Will we have a city which has the grain and the intensity and the vibrancy of what has been there in the past, without in any way romanticizing the city of the poor? Those are the issues that I think are important to discuss, and we will in Dharavi. It is a political issue. Cities and mayors are becoming critical figures. Saskia has argued sometimes more important than even nation states in mobilizing action on the ground, even of a global nature such as climate change. And we'll be discussing the impacts on that. And, you know, it gives us enormous pleasure, particularly in London, to see that New York, Mayor Bloomberg, and I know there are colleagues here from there, is trying to copy what London has done. This gives us enormous pleasure, I have to repeat. Will it ever happen there? It depends more on the governance structure than it does on a will. And I think this is something that we will be discussing and have really focused on the urban age over the last couple of years. These are the cities that we've visited. We are starting now in a new cycle, 2007, looking at 4 Indian cities. We will be moving to South America next year, to Sao Paulo, and then our 3rd year, 2009, will be in Istanbul and looking at city regions there. I'm not going to go through this in great detail because I think we've summarized and understood what the issues are, but I just want to stress that in this new cycle of work that we're doing collectively with the Herhausen Society, not only are we having a conference, we are creating a body of work, of knowledge, which will hopefully be reflected back into the cities and countries that we've been working. We are developing the Deutsche Bank Urban Age Award, which will be given every year in each of the city regions that we are visiting. We are developing a very rich website and e-bulletins which update everyone who's been involved. And in fact, we will also be publishing a large book in a few months' time. Now, I've stressed that we have looked at the DNA of cities, and probably this is the first time that a group of scholars from different parts of the world have looked at things like where people of different age actually live in cities as diverse as New York, London and Shanghai and Berlin. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just look at the average age of people in Berlin. It's getting old. It's a city which is aging. You then look at the 4 Indian cities we've analyzed, and you see that these maps are all squashed down at the bottom. They're young. This is the potential for the future. It's where the average age is between 10 and 29, and therefore impacting on the decisions made there, I think, is absolutely critical to what happens. Harnessing the energy is critical to its success. We've looked, not only because we're at the London School of Economics, Howard, but because it is important to understand the role of cities as part of the global economy. We'll hear more about that. And it is fascinating to see how cities, of course, are becoming more and more service-orientated rather than otherwise orientated in terms of manufacturing and other things. We've also interviewed people in these cities to understand what the themes are, what worries people on the ground. And in India, the word planning comes up number 1 nearly as the bigger concern. In Sao Paulo, it's transport. In Berlin, no one has a job, so it's labor markets. So it's interesting to see it from the other side and what actually happens there. Now look at what happened in cities over the last 10, 15, 30 years. These are cities which are in blue, over 1 million people. And look at the concentration in your continent and in Asia. And look at, again, how cities have grown in yellow. Tokyo on the far left of this map over the last 20, 30 years. And then what's going to happen in the next 10 years in blue, where the greatest growth is going to be? Well, the greatest growth clearly is again in these areas where at the moment there's a fast developing economy, strongly changing society, with enormous impacts, I think, on the ground. I mean, you have a choice again, either to grow like this, Shanghai, this has showed what's happened in the last 15 years in terms of density, or Mexico City. You go exactly the other way, and it becomes a vast, nearly endless city, which is the title of the book we've given. It's a city that you literally don't know where it ends, which has no skin, no barrier to it. Why is this relevant to everything we're talking about? Because at one simple level, not only do spread out cities fragment social connections, they also have a massively negative impact on energy consumption, a key issue for us all. Just remember this, that 75%, and this is part of our research, of cities around the world now consume world energy and contribute 75% therefore to CO2 emissions. So a small impact on that makes actually quite a big difference to the global equation. And basically air conditioning, lighting and using of cars rather than other forms of more sustainable transport are why we cities consume so much energy. Therefore, the density aspect is extremely important. If you have a very tight city with a lot of people, like many of the Indian cities are, in that sense, it's highly efficient. If you have a spread out city like London, or more so without a good transport system like Mexico City, it is far less efficient. So part of the work that we've done is to study densities across all these cities. Now, we thought New York and Shanghai were pretty high. Look at the 4 Indian cities. Again, I'm not going to go into detail, but it's interesting to see the difference in sort of scale of densities that we're talking about. When cities spread out, as in Sao Paulo, and use up valuable natural resources, which could be the mangroves of Mumbai or elsewhere, you really consume energy, potential resources like water and others, and really end up killing a city. I've touched about governance. We're going to go back on this on tomorrow, but let me just refer to the fact that we studied for the first time, actually in a very graphic way, the difference between how different organizations at central level, government level, at state level, and therefore regional level, city level, and ward or more democratic level are organized. This is not to say one is better than the other, but London, interestingly, and I see the Secretary of State for London, Tessa Jowell, who's just walked in, who's therefore one of the boxes up there, is rediscovering the relationship between central government and a real metropolitan government with a mayor who is elected by the people, still with a strong democratic base in green at the bottom. We've studied a number of cities, and we have found in India that that system is very different. And I think the impacts of that different system is very important to understand. Let me rush, in the last few minutes left, to a few conclusions about what works and what doesn't. Certainly in London, we found that the mayor, because he's responsible for the whole metropolitan area and not a region, has been able to make some very big decisions. He's decided that no future development, even though London is growing at quite a pace, can happen outside that boundary. It all happens within the city. Therefore, development is all concentrated on industrial land, ex-industrial land, in the middle of the city. London is growing for that reason. All the new housing, and this is a mayor's policy, has to be done in such a way that half of it, 50%, needs to be affordable. He was even able to implement, that's why you see Ken Livingstone smiling over there, this congestion charge, because he's making quite a lot of money through this process, reduced traffic by 20%, and on the whole made London more livable, and also responsible for a new plan which will make London probably one of the more advanced in terms of carbon dioxide emission. We've heard from Rakesh, and we will hear from Enrique, the great things that actually have been done in a city which is poor and is difficult, but actually nobilized through the intervention of different public systems, cycleways and others. Meanwhile, Mexico City, faced with exactly the same problems, bills double level highways, an issue that you know here is very important and very popular. Now, the question to reflect on is that while petrol is cheap in some of these countries, that's okay, but this is what happens. This is what happens on the double motorway in Mexico City. It seems to be permanently blocked and doesn't really resolve the issues. Now, the last two issues I want to talk about are to do with the physical fabric of city and the key issue of housing. This is an attempt in Mexico City to deal with the housing problem. Now, this is exactly the point that I was trying to raise, that if you want to link the social to the physical and understand the implications on society, we all know in this room what it means to live in a place like this without social facilities and others. And I think as architects and as planners and as city mayors who are here, one has to perhaps really think about whether the future of a city like Mexico City is correct when you have an environment like Santa Fe where all the middle classes are moving out to an area like here, or perhaps a more integrated and subtle approach where you have some more subtle housing, schools and other facilities which are more integrated with the grain of the surroundings in the old Santa Fe is a better solution. I think that will be an important thing to discuss when we come to Dharavi. South Africa, Johannesburg, is living through a difficult cycle that Lindsay Bremer will talk about, with the city centre becoming void, with people leaving the city centre because of fear and crime, not a problem you have at the moment in Indian cities, but moving out to cities behind walls and gates. This is happening in Indian cities, even though there isn't an issue of crime. And I think the implications in terms of the design of housing needs to be understood, but there are some success stories. There's some beautiful, very successful housing right in the middle of Johannesburg in one of the toughest areas where now people from mixed income are able to live right next to the services they need. Now here I want to be slightly controversial as I come to conclude, Howard. This is an aerial view of part of your city here in Mumbai. And on the far left, you see some white structures, which seen from the air could look like industrial elements of some sort or another. You go close and this is what it is, and many of you will recognize it as part of the important project of relocating slum housing, some of the pavement dwellers and others as a result of the important infrastructure projects which are happening. Now, I have to question whether, with all the intelligence that we have, creating housing of this sort, with 8-story housing, with little public amenities, is the solution to the future of this city. And I hope we can perhaps collectively talk about other issues. Because I'm convinced, and this is where I really do want to conclude, that unless one understands the grain of the city at a physical level, the structure of the spaces and the buildings, and make them seamless and connected, perhaps like in New York or other cities, it is very, very difficult to create cities which are integrated, connected, and sustainable for the future. Thank you very much.